In the previous units, we've been working on the critical skills of finding psychological research and being able to interpret that research, being able to understand the jargon, the language, and what we've been working on now is understanding the particularities of the results section, recognizing what the researchers are trying to say with their statistical results and how to interpret those results. In the previous lesson, we talked a little bit about correlation coefficients. We use those whenever we're attempting to see how associated two variables are with each other. What happens to y when x goes up? However, a lot of the time, we're also interested in differences between groups, not just looking at how much two variables are associated with each other, but looking at how one group functions differently from another group. So instead of looking at associations, we're interested in looking at mean differences. As we talked about in the previous unit, correlational studies go out into the world and measure variables that exist, then compare them. In experimental studies, the type of studies we'll be talking about today, the researchers, instead of measuring a variable, manipulate that variable. That is, they set the level of the independent variable and look at the results on the dependent variable as the independent variable changes. So in these cases, instead of looking at the similarities or the associations between variables, what I'm doing is looking at how two different groups of people might function differently on the same dependent variable, on the same outcome. Let me just give you an example that I really like. It shows the social power of situations. So let's say, for example, that I take half of you and put you in one room, and take the other half of you and put you in the same room but at a different time. I ask that first group to think about a time when you remember being socially included. A time when maybe you were playing a sport in elementary school and you were one of the first people picked for the dodgeball team. A time when your friends made you feel particularly loved or included as a part of the group. Or a time in general when you were a part of a social unit and feeling generally very socially included. I would take the other group in the same room and ask them to think about something different. This group I would ask to think about a time when you were feeling socially excluded. A time when you were picked last for a game, when you felt like all of your friends were having a party but you weren't invited, or generally a time when you were outside of the social group. That's the manipulated independent variable. One group is asked to think about times when they feel socially included, and another group is asked to think about times when they feel socially excluded. Afterwards, we ask both groups to estimate the temperature in the room. So I ask the group who's been included to think about, what's the temperature in the room right now? How warm does it feel? And I ask the group who's been excluded to think, what's the temperature in the room right now? How warm does it feel? What we find is that just remembering being included or excluded can change people's perceptions of the temperature of a room. We can compare the mean of those groups, on average, how warm did people in the inclusion group think the room was, and on average, how warm did people in the exclusion group think the room was, and compare those two means to each other. The results are displayed in this bar graph here. On the x-axis, we have the two different groups. Group 1, a memory of being excluded, and Group 2, a memory of being included. On the y-axis, we have the dependent variable, the estimated room temperature, the thing that we think might change as a result of the independent variable. What we find is that those who had a memory of being excluded, on average, rated the room at just between 70 and 71 degrees, while those who had a memory of being included rated the room much warmer at 75 or so degrees. So we could conclude that people who are asked to remember something that excludes them perceived the room to be more cold. If you've ever heard the phrase, the cold shoulder, this may have something to do with that. Feeling excluded feels physically cold. Just like a correlation coefficient tells you the extent to which two groups are related to each other, we use statistical tests to determine whether or not these groups are reliably different from each other. We'll talk about that in a little more detail in the next skill video. But what you should be looking for when we're testing group comparisons are two different types of statistics. One is a t-statistic, or a t-test. In a t-test, we compare two, and only two, groups on the means on some dependent variable. So for this, I would compute a t-test that would give me a t-value that we'll talk about how to interpret in the next video. It would tell me whether or not these groups are reliably different from each other. But for right now, what I want you to focus on is that we're trying to compare this mean, this average of temperature in the memory being included group, with this mean, this average of people in the memory being excluded group, to see if they're different. Another statistic you might see comparing mean differences is the F statistic. The t-test is used to compare two different groups, but the F-test, or the ANOVA, can be used to test more than two groups. An ANOVA, or an F-test, tells you whether there's a difference in the means between three or more groups, while a t-test tells you if there's a difference between the means of two groups. Just like we did with the previous example, I'd like to show you what this looks like in a real published paper. In this article, we went to the Netherlands and recruited participants either outside of a religious building or a civic building, and we looked to see if there were differences between the people who were surveyed while they were looking at a church versus when they were looking at a town hall. So you can see this journal article published in the International Journal for the Psychology of Religion is called Differences in Attitudes Towards Outgroups in Religious and Non-Religious Contexts in a Multinational Sample, a Situational Context Priming Study. You can see the results in a table that shows you the mean differences between groups. So table 1 here is showing our mean differences and standard deviations between religious and control contexts on attitudes towards various groups. So down this column, we have all of the different groups that people were asked how warm or cold they felt towards those groups on a scale from 1 to 10. So they were asked about how they feel about Africans, or Asians, or Europeans, or Arabs, or foreigners, or the rich, or the poor, or Christians, or Jews, or Muslims, or gay men, or lesbian women. They were each asked all of these questions. Some people were in the religious context. Some people were in the control context. We compared the average results for each of these across the religious context, and that's what these numbers represent, and across the control context, and that's what these numbers represent. What you see here is that the religious context numbers are lower than the control context numbers. If we just take one group, for example, attitudes towards gay men, we see that on the whole, in the religious condition, the average attitudes towards gay men, where 10 is very warm and 0 is very cold, were 5.78, or right around the midpoint of the scale. People feel generally pretty neutral towards gay men in the religious condition. However, in the control condition, that value was 7.29, much closer to warm, or 10, than in this case at 5.78. As a result, what we see across all of these is that the control condition tends to be higher than the religious condition. You can see the F statistics being displayed here, and again, we'll talk about how to interpret these in the next skill. But this statistic tells you whether or not this difference is big enough to be reliable. And what we see from these are the biggest F statistics are the ones where the difference is biggest. So the biggest difference between the religious context and the control context comes in African and Asian attitudes, in attitudes towards Europeans and Arabs. The smallest difference comes in attitudes towards Christians. So it looks like between the Christian and the non-Christian context, there's very little difference among attitudes towards Christians, but among attitudes towards lesbian women, for example, attitudes in the control condition were much more positive than attitudes in the religious condition. I could display each of these in a bar graph, showing that the bar for the control side is higher than the bar for the religious side. And I would do that in much the same way as the figure I showed you earlier, with the two groups represented as two different bars on the x-axis, and the dependent variable represented as a continuous measure on the y-axis, going up and down. What I want you to do in this skill assignment is very similar to what we did in the previous assignment. I want you to locate a study, read through its results sections, and report where they compare two or more groups against each other, and what statistic they use to report that difference.